He came home every night. That is the detail that stays with you when you try to understand the Gilgo Beach case. Not the 13 years, not the bodies wrapped in burlap, not the pizza box on Fifth Avenue that ended everything. The detail that stays is that Rex Heuermann came home every night to a house in Massapequa Park where his wife and children were. He had dinner. He watched television. He slept in his own bed. He drove to his office in Midtown Manhattan the next morning. He ran an architectural consulting firm. He had a daughter who worked for him. He was, by every account available to the people around him, simply there, present, contained, ordinary. He did this for 17 years. The murders began in 1993 and continued through 2010. 8 women. Between each one, Rex Heuermann went home. The 8 women were Sandra Costilla, 28, whose body was found in a wooded area on the east side of Long Island in 1993. Karen Vergata, 34, who disappeared in February 1996 and whose remains were found on Fire Island that April and listed as Jane Doe No. 7 for the next 27 years. Jessica Taylor, 20, partial remains found in 2003 and more remains found in 2011. Valerie Mack, 24, whose remains were found in 2011, and the 4 women known as the Gilgo 4. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello, all found within a short distance of each other, wrapped in burlap in December 2010. Each of these women was someone's daughter. Most of them were somebody's mother. The families of those who were identified had been waiting, in some cases, for over 30 years by the time Rex Heuermann stood in a Suffolk County courtroom and admitted what he had done. The investigation that would eventually produce his arrest began, as investigations of this kind often do, not with the crimes themselves, but with something else entirely. In May 2010, a 23-year-old woman named Shannan Gilbert was working as an escort on Long Island's South Shore. On the night of May 1st, she called 911 from inside a client's home in Oak Beach. The call lasted 23 minutes. She was screaming. She said there was somebody after her and they were going to kill her. She ran from the house and disappeared into the night. Her body was found 18 months later in a tidal marsh near Oak Beach. Medical examiners determined she had most likely drowned accidentally. Her family has never accepted that conclusion. But the search for Shannan Gilbert changed everything, because when investigators began searching the stretch of Ocean Parkway along Long Island's South Shore for any trace of her, they found other bodies, many other bodies. In December 2010, remains were discovered that would eventually be identified as Melissa Barthelemy, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Amber Lynn Costello, and Megan Waterman. 4 women, all young, all sex workers, all found within a short distance of each other, along the same stretch of highway, all wrapped in burlap. These 4 became known collectively as the Gilgo 4. As the search continued into 2011, more remains emerged. Jessica Taylor, Valerie Mack, an unidentified woman investigators called Peaches, a toddler who was eventually identified as Peach's daughter. Partial remains connecting to victims found years earlier in other locations. An unidentified Asian male and a woman whose remains had been found on Fire Island in 1996, who had been listed as Jane Doe number 7 for nearly 3 decades before being identified in 2023 as Karen Vagata. By the end of the search, 11 sets of human remains had been found along a stretch of beach highway on Long Island. The investigation stalled almost immediately and stayed stalled for over a decade. The women who were found had been contacted through burner phones, prepaid devices purchased specifically for that purpose, registered to nothing, traceable only to the cell towers they pinged. The FBI had analyzed those towers as early as the initial investigation and had found that the calls came from towers concentrated in 2 areas: Midtown Manhattan and a residential area on Long Island's South Shore. The pattern was consistent. Someone was making calls to victims from a Manhattan office or its vicinity. The same person was active in the same residential area in the evenings. It pointed toward someone with a regular commute, someone who worked in Manhattan and lived on Long Island. In 2011, that description fit approximately 1 million people. The investigation went cold. Investigators came and went. Years passed. The case became a subject of books, documentaries, a Netflix film. The victims were named, were given back their identities by investigative journalists who paid attention to them when the system did not, were mourned publicly in ways that sometimes felt like the mourning was louder outside the investigation than inside it. Their families waited. Rex Heuermann drove to Manhattan every morning and came home to Massapequa Park every night. In February 2022, Suffolk County's new district attorney, Ray Tierney, announced the formation of a new multi-agency task force specifically dedicated to the Gilgo Beach case. The task force included Suffolk County Police, the Suffolk County Sheriff's Office, the New York State Police, and the FBI. What made this task force different from previous efforts was not the agencies involved, but the approach. They went back to everything from the beginning, combined resources, and began running every thread simultaneously. One of those threads led, within a month, to Rex Heuermann. A witness had reported seeing a green pickup truck, a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche, near the home of one of the victims, Amber Lynn Costello, in the days before she disappeared. That model of truck was distinctive. The task force ran the registration records and found one registered to Rex Heuermann of Massapequa Park. His cell tower data was then compared to the existing analysis of the burner phones. The patterns matched. The towers where the burners had pinged, Manhattan and the South Shore, were the same towers Heuermann's personal phone was using. The same times, the same locations. By March 2022, Rex Heuermann was the task force's primary suspect. He was 60 years old. He had been running his architectural consulting firm, RH Consultants, from a Midtown Manhattan office for decades. He had been married to Asa Ellerup, originally from Iceland, since 1996. They had a daughter together, Victoria, who worked for his firm. He had a stepson, Christopher Sheridan, who had developmental disabilities and lived at home. The family had been in the Massapequa Park house for years. Neighbors described Heuermann in ways that varied. Some said he was unfriendly, standoffish, the kind of neighbor you crossed the street to avoid. Others said he was just a large, quiet man who kept to himself. Nobody said anything that would have qualified as a warning. The task force did not arrest Heuermann. In March 2022, they watched him. The surveillance lasted over a year. Investigators followed his movements, mapped his daily routine, documented where he went and when. They needed a DNA sample. Hair had been recovered from the burlap, used to wrap the victims. Male hair, consistent across multiple victims, not matching anyone in any existing database. To close the case, the task force needed to place Rex Heuermann's DNA against that hair. In January 2023, an investigator watched Heuermann walk into a Himalayan Pie Company pizza restaurant on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan and buy a couple of slices. Heuermann ate, left the crust in the box, and threw the box in a garbage can on the street. The investigator waited until he was gone, then retrieved the box. The pizza crust went to the crime lab. The mitochondrial DNA extracted from the leftover pizza crust matched the mitochondrial DNA from the male hair recovered from the burlap wrapped around Megan Waterman's body. The task force had what they needed. On July 13th, 2023, Rex Heuermann was arrested in Manhattan near his office. He was taken to a Suffolk County facility and booked. His attorney said that a tearful Heuermann, still in custody, insisted he didn't do this. Investigators had reviewed his search history at that point and found that he had been compulsively searching for photographs of the victims and their family members. He had been looking up their relatives. He had been tracking the investigation from the inside of a house in Massapequa Park while the investigation looked for him. The following morning, the Suffolk County Police Commissioner stood at a press conference and said the words that would define the case's public narrative. Rex Heuermann is a demon that walks among us. Commissioner Rodney Harrison said, a predator that ruined families. At that same moment, in Massapequa Park, Asa Ellerup was processing the information that her husband of nearly 30 years was being charged with serial murder. Her attorney described the family as shocked, disgusted, and devastated. Her son Christopher, who had developmental disabilities, cried himself to sleep. Her daughter Victoria, who had worked for her father's firm and would now struggle to find new employment because of what his name had become, sat in their home and tried to understand what had happened to their lives. They had no idea. Prosecutors confirmed it explicitly. There was no indication the family had any knowledge of the suspected crimes. The family had no idea because Heuermann had gone home every night. He had been, from their perspective, simply there. A husband who worked in Manhattan, a father who came home, a man who had been sharing a house with people who loved him while keeping, in every other dimension of his life, a secret that had now been 17 years in the building. The task force searched the Massapequa Park house for 12 days. When they left, Ellerup said the interior was uninhabitable. Items thrown everywhere, her couch shredded, evidence tape marking objects that had been taken. She described waking at night, shivering with anxiety, having to improvise a place to sleep because her bed was gone. In the months that followed the July 2023 arrest, the charges expanded. In January 2024, Heuermann was charged with the murder of Maureen Brainard Barnes, the fourth of the Gilgo Four. In June 2024, he was charged with the murders of Jessica Taylor and Sandra Costilla. Costilla's case dated to 1993, making it the oldest of the charges, the first known killing, the beginning of a 17-year period during which Heuermann drove to work and came home and drove to work again. A hair found beneath Jessica Taylor's remains had been matched to Heuermann in the same manner as the pizza crust. Each new charge brought the same evidence structure, the cell tower data, the physical description, the DNA applied to another name, another woman, another family that had been waiting for decades. In December 2024, Heuermann was charged with the murder of Valerie Mack. He was now charged with 7 killings. He had pleaded not guilty to all of them. On April 8, 2026, Rex Heuermann changed his plea. He entered a Suffolk County courtroom in Riverhead, New York, and admitted to 8 murders, the 7 charged killings, and an 8th, Karen Vergata, whose remains had been found on Fire Island in 1996 and identified as Jane Doe No. 7 for nearly 3 decades before her name was finally restored to her in 2023. Heuermann admitted to killing her too. He was not formally charged with her death, but admitted to it as part of the plea. 8 women, the oldest crime dating to 1993. The most recent to 2010, 17 years. Asa Ellerup and Victoria Heuermann attended the hearing. They sat in the back row. Ellerup, who had spent nearly 2 years publicly expressing doubt that her husband was responsible, who had called him a family man and her hero in a documentary, leaned forward in her seat and gripped the back of the chair in front of her as he made each admission. Victoria wept. Across the courtroom, the families of the victims also wept. They had waited far longer. Heuermann was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The task force that caught him operated quietly for 14 months before the arrest. They did not announce Heuermann as a suspect. They did not alert the media. They watched and collected and waited for the pizza box, and then they moved. The DA, Ray Tierney, later said the plan to operate quietly had worked as intended. The architecture of the investigation was itself a kind of precision, methodical, unhurried, certain, the same qualities investigators noted without irony that the suspect had apparently brought to his crimes. The Massapequa Park house still stands on the same street. The south shore of Long Island looks the way it always looked. The stretch of Ocean Parkway along Gilgo Beach is the same stretch of road. It was in 2010 when investigators walked it, looking for a young woman who had vanished and found, instead, the bodies that would eventually become the defining case of the region. Shannan Gilbert's family still believes she was killed. The investigation has not resolved that question. 8 other families received in a courtroom in Riverhead in April 2026. The specific words that 30 years of waiting had been building toward. The man who had killed their daughters, sisters, and mothers stood before a judge and said the things that were true. He said them quietly, in the language the court required, in a room that was full of people for whom the words were both too late and exactly necessary. Rex Heuermann had come home every night for 17 years. Then the pizza box went into the garbage on 5th Avenue, and the investigators who had been watching him picked it up, and it went to a lab, and the lab ran its test, and the result came back, and he didn't come home anymore. There is a specific quality to this case that separates it from other long-duration serial killer investigations, and it is worth naming directly. Rex Heuermann was not hiding. He was not operating under a false identity, not living off the grid, not concealing his existence from the systems designed to find people. He was in the phone book. His business had a website. His name was on a company registration. His commute ran along the same routes every day. He was findable. He had been findable for 30 years. What protected him was not invisibility, but ordinariness. The complete, unbroken ordinariness of a man who went to work and came home and had no criminal record and lived on a residential street in a Long Island suburb where nothing unusual ever happened. The cell tower data that pointed to him had been available in principle since the early investigation. The connection between Midtown Manhattan and the South Shore had been in the FBI's analysis since 2011. What the new task force did in 2022 was not discover something that hadn't existed before. They applied sustained, combined attention to evidence that had been sitting in the existing record and found that it pointed at a specific man whose truck had been noted by a witness, whose phone matched the towers, whose DNA matched the hair. The pizza box was the confirmation of something the investigation already knew. It was the object that turned suspicion into evidence. But the pizza box happened because investigators were patient enough to wait for it, to follow a man through his daily routine and wait for him to discard something that contained himself. He discarded it without looking back. He threw it in a garbage can on 5th Avenue and walked away, the way a person walks away from any garbage can in any city on any ordinary day. And the investigators who had been watching him for over a year moved in and retrieved it. And the 17-year case began its final chapter. Asa Ellerup divorced Rex Heuermann in 2025. She had spent nearly 2 years after his arrest saying publicly that she did not believe he had done it, that he was a family man, that he was her hero. She had sat in a Peacock documentary and said these things to a camera, and then she sat in a Suffolk County courtroom in April 2026 and heard him say, in specific terms, that he had, and she gripped the back of the chair in front of her and listened. The victims' families were on the other side of the room. They had been listening for 30 years. There is one more thing that belongs in the record of this case, and it is the thing that the victims' families have returned to repeatedly in the years since the arrest and the plea. The women who were killed were not anonymous. They had names and histories, and families who looked for them and mourned them and kept looking and kept mourning for years, and in some cases, decades. Melissa, Barthelomew's sister, Amanda, was 16 years old when Melissa disappeared. She received calls from a man who taunted her about her sister's death. Calls that came from one of Heuermann's burner phones from the tower near his Manhattan office multiple times. She answered those calls, not knowing who was on the other end. She answered them hoping for information. She received cruelty instead. Maureen Brainard Barnes was 25 years old and the mother of a daughter when she went missing in 2007. Her family had been searching for her for 3 years before her remains were found in 2010. Megan Waterman was 22 and the mother of a young daughter. Amber Lynn Costello was 27. Sandra Costilla was 28 and had been dead for over a decade before anyone connected her death to the man who killed her. Karen Vergata had been listed as Jane Doe for 27 years before her name was given back to her. These women were failed by the investigation in its original iteration in ways that the task force formed in 2022 was explicitly designed to acknowledge and correct. The earlier investigations had been criticized for treating the victims' lives and circumstances as factors that made the case harder to solve, rather than as the reason the case needed to be solved. The new task force operated from a different premise. The D. Ray Tierney said it plainly. These were human beings. The investigation would treat them that way. When Rex Heuermann stood in the Suffolk County courtroom on April 8, 2026, and admitted to 8 murders, the Suffolk County Police Commissioner said that justice had been served. The families of the victims said other things. They said they were relieved, but not healed. They said a plea was not the same as a trial. They said the names of their daughters and sisters and mothers. They said they had spent too many years wondering, and now they had an answer, and the answer didn't give them back what they had lost. Rex Heuermann went home every night for 17 years. He is not going home again.